Plenty of news out of Europe this week with the market response to the European bank stress testing. BP also announced today a second quarter loss of $17 billion and up to $30 billion in asset sales and the removal of its embattled chief executive, Tony Hayward. To discuss these developments, I was joined a short time ago by Stephen Pope from Cantor Fitzgerald in London. Stephen Pope, welcome back to Late Line Business.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be here.
Well, the market seems to have taken these bank stress tests very much in its stride, even though the tests only envisaged a mild recession and no sovereign borrower default.
Yes, I think that most people have written off the stress tests as being something of a non-event because it was almost designed with the ultimate answer in mind, i.e. let's get as many banks through the hurdle as we can. I think what you've seen in the course of Monday's trading in Europe was perhaps a degree of short covering, perhaps there was a degree of disclosure that we hadn't had before from one or two of the banks, but there's still many unanswered questions, and I don't think you can say this has resolved the issue at all.
Yes, well, on closer scrutiny of these stress tests, it's extraordinary how different countries seem to have been treated in different ways. For instance, in Greece, the worst-case scenario was a 2% fall in house prices in 2011. I think one analyst thought that was a typo, whereas in Spain, the test was a 28%, the worst-case scenario, fall in house prices from top to bottom.
I think, as I was saying, that it was designed to make sure that as many institutions were able to pass as they could get through. Those that have failed we already knew were in need of radical restructuring. I suppose the real key point was that they needed to make sure that none, certainly not too many, of the German lenders' banks were found to be in breach of running shy on their capital requirement levels. So it's been designed with what was the ultimate answer in mind. I think that the fact that you've seen great discrepancies between various key metric movements in each individual nation is rather disappointing. And we haven't had as full a disclosure as we would like to have done, particularly from the Germans. So, all in all, quite an unsatisfactory exercise.
Yeah, the European regulator wasn't at all happy with the German banks over the disclosure. Has this made the market suspicious of just what might be sitting in some German banks?
Well, certainly I think that you could take the view that the large German banks, such as Deutsche and Commerz, are not in such bad shape. But you start getting down into the state or the lender banks there, they really have got certain difficulties. And I think the way that they defined what we call Tier 1 capital really was structured so that the German lenders banks would be able to come through this exercise in good heart. And you have to ask the question that if everything was all fine and tickety-boo, shall we say, why is it that the banking supervisors, when they came to interpret the Basel conditions drawn up last year, have watered it down in terms of what is required and how much time is allowed to achieve what is required? So really it's a very unsatisfactory exercise. It leaves many questions, and I think that people are just shaking their head and feeling, what was the point?
Is one of the reasons why spreads are being affected as they are the suspicion about the German banks?
I think that you've seen that there's been a long-standing suspicion about the state of the German lenders banks because they have had quite a lot of difficult issues upon their books. They also have quite a lot of exposure to other parts of Eastern Europe that are not necessarily within the core body of the European Union and certainly not the Eurozone at the current time. And if we started answering all those questions, I think we would find that the European banking landscape would be in a far worse condition than we supposedly have discovered at the release of the results on Friday. So once again, you come back and say that there has not been a rigorous enough examination. This was not very stressful, and the banks have not been given a hard workout.
7 banks failed the test of the 90 or so that were put through the mill. Most of them were Spanish. Do you think this actually, in a way, bodes well for the rest of the Spanish banks, that they will actually, because of their fairly open disclosure, now be able to get credit more easily?
I think if anything does come out of this is that we actually have to give a bit of credit to Spain because they knew that there was a problem within the economy. They knew that the real estate market had collapsed. So as you mentioned, the housing price decline that was modelled in Spain is rather extreme. But I do suggest that what we've seen is that the banks that have failed, we knew were in difficulty. So it doesn't actually shed any new light upon the Spanish banking situation. The only reason we have to praise the Spanish is that they were really pushing for as much disclosure as possible. And reluctantly, the French and the Germans were forced and obliged to join that type of party. Although, as we've seen, the Germans have been dragging their feet as well. So It doesn't answer all the questions, and it just confirms, I think, that Europe once again has made a classic fudge, try to get as many names through the system as we can without actually doing too much damage.
I suppose the one piece of good news to come out of all this is that it has led to some more disclosure for analysts, bank analysts, the rest of the market to be able to look at many European banks, because the British banks obviously went through their own crisis and are now presumably quite well capitalised.
Yes, I mean, those banks that had to seek recourse to the UK government for assistance, so we think of Royal Bank of Scotland in the main, but also the Lloyds Banking Group, after Lloyds TSB was obliged by Her Majesty's government, as it was, to take over HBOS, then they have had plenty of money pumped in from the taxpayer, so their balance sheets are far more rigorous than they once were. So it's no surprise to see that happen. But what does surprise me is that given the new UK coalition government have been so vigorous in trying to tackle the burgeoning budget deficit, you actually had to take 10% off the value of British government bonds, but only 14% off Portuguese. This is ludicrous because when you start having that type of irrational analysis on what is a risky asset, it's no wonder that all the Portuguese banks got through. So it's a very strange methodology that was applied here.
Before you go, can I just ask you one on BP and its chief executive? There's rumours now that he's going to be sent to the Russian front.
Yeah, I think what you have here is a situation where they're trying to detract some of the venom that would come through from arguments about what he's being paid. We have to be clear that what he is paid is only what he's entitled to under his contract, and politicians should not be involved in that issue. That should be for shareholders to be upset about if they are. Now, Mr. Hayward is still an extremely talented individual, a good business brain, good geological mind, and he knows the people that run the BP TNK system very well. He was only over there recently. It could even be, I wouldn't be at all surprised if this was something that was discussed behind the scenes, and this is an easy way to sort of transition his exit. And also, it just doesn't sort of take too much spotlight away from Mr. Dudley, who now has this difficult role of being the chief executive elect, so to say, but